Hello, my learning friends. Welcome to Hip Use History as we take a whack at some labor histories today, taking a look at one of the biggest industrial disasters in American history, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, which occurred on March 25th, 1911 in the heart of New York City in Greenwich Village. So we're going to take a look at kind of the context of that time period, the fire itself, and most importantly, the consequences that are going to follow through. So what are we waiting for? Why don't we go giddy up for learning and go get her done right now. So context is key, and we certainly by 1911 are into the progressive era. We've already gone through the heights of the kind of laissez-faire industrial Gilded Age, where we've seen some federal reform. Remember, muckrakers have been around for a while. We have authors like Frank Norris with The Octopus and Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and even dealing with urban poverty like Jacob Riis, who was a photographer who put out How the Other Half Lives. So people are aware of the plight of kind of urban life and what it's like to live in tenement houses and have this kind of terrible existence. But people really haven't felt it here, and that's what's going to occur in 1911. Now, we do have unions. Unions are fighting hard at this time period. They're not getting a lot of love, a lot of recognition, a lot of power in terms of arbitration, but they're around. In fact, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union had organized two huge strikes in the previous years. In 1909, they organized the Uprising of 20,000, which started at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, where 20% of New York City garment workers walked out, and then they went to arbitration, and they really didn't get anything. In 1910, they also had a huge walkout as well, where tens of thousands of workers in this called the Great Revolt went on strike, demanding better wages. But they really weren't getting love from the politicians of New York City and in the New York State legislature, which was controlled by Tammany Hall, a very corrupt democratic political machine that was really aiming for Irish Catholic votes and wasn't really big on reform and had a lot of business love. But that's all going to change because we do have these terrible conditions which are going to lead to this fire. Now, this is going to occur in Greenwich Village. It's just south of Washington Square Park, in fact, and what was called the ASCH building, constructed in 1900. It's a 10-story building, and it's basically just a series of lofts on top of each other. And the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th floors, way on the tippy top. And it exactly wasn't up to fire code, if you know what I mean by today's standards. In fact, instead of the mandated 3 stairwells, they only had 2 stairwells. They had a couple freight elevators, and then they had kind of a rickety fire escape on the other side of the building. And conditions are going to be ripe for a fire. It's overcrowded. The doors are going to be locked. Not only did they lock them to keep activists, union activists, from coming in, but they didn't want workers taking smoke breaks and losing productivity, so they would lock the doors. And there is no fire alarm, there is no fire sprinklers, there's no real communication that's going on that are going to allow these people to know what's going on. And it's the end of a workday. It's 4:40. It's a Saturday. These workers work 6 days a week, and in fact, they're only making in today's money about $3 an hour. There are 500 people on these 3 floors, most of them recent teenage girl immigrants, Jewish immigrants coming from Germany, coming from Italy. They don't speak much English, and they're working these low-paid jobs because they have no other way to secure what they think is going to be the American dream. But that's all going to end, like I said, on March 25th, 1911. Let's go to the fire. So how the fire started is a matter of debate. Most historians agree it was probably from a lit cigarette or a match. Now, they had huge tables with sewing machines that the workers would sit at all day making these popular garments of the day, the shirt waist that were kind of dresses for women. But they had huge steel bins underneath their wooden tables that they would throw all of the extra fabric in. And there was over 2 months on that day of fabric in these steel bins, which is basically lint in a big steel bin, just waiting for a disaster to occur. It also could have been overheated sewing machines. They were going on all day long. They did heat up, and that very well could have been the cause. And there are some conspiratorialists out there that claim it could have been arson, that the Shirtwaist Factory wasn't doing very well, and this was kind of something that business owners would do. They would burn their buildings down and collect the insurance money and then move to a different market. But either way, the fire is going to break out on the 8th floor at 4:40 p.m. on March 25th, 1911. And it is going to spread quickly. In fact, some of the charred bodies were actually people still at their sewing stations, kind of lumped over in this charcoal state after the fact. Now, there was a bookkeeper that was able to call the 10th floor. Now, the 10th floor, interestingly enough, that's where the bosses were on that Saturday. They had actually brought their kids to visit the factory, and we have Max Blanche and Isaac Harris who own the building, and they're going to escape because on the 10th floor, there was a stairwell that led to the roof. Most of the survivors are going to get out that way. And there were New York University students in the building next to them that helped them escape. But that escape route, that stairwell below the 10th floor is going to be blocked by the flames. So nobody else is going to be able to use that stairwell. The other stairwell is locked, and the floor manager with the key, he's already gotten out of Dodge, so there's no way going that way. Now, there were 2 freight elevators, and at least one of those freight elevators made 3 trips up and down that building, rescuing upwards of 100 of the women and some of the men as well. But eventually the heat's going to get too much for that elevator, as well as numerous girls that were jumping into the elevator shaft and landing on the elevator, so it couldn't make any more trips. Now, the only other escape route was that rickety fire escape outside of the building. 20 girls did kind of, scurry down that, but another 20 or 30 were hanging for dear life on that. When it ripped from the building, it was all rusted and corroded, and they fell to their deaths on that fire escape. So there's still about 100, 120, 130 girls that are trapped in that building, and many of them are going to get crushed to death trying to get out the locked door. Many of them are going to burn to death because the fire is just going to consume them. But there were dozens and dozens that made their way to the windows of the building on the 9th floor and some on the 8th floor. And by this time, about 5 o'clock, 20 minutes later, there are 35 fire engines. Now, they had the most modern fire engines in the world, but the ladders only went up to the 7th floor, so they're not going to be able to rescue anybody like that. And then as this crowd gathers, as reporters and families and fire people are watching, the bodies start falling. Dozens and dozens of young girls, as the city looks up and watch, are going to hold hands and close their eyes and jump off the 8th and the 9th floor. Eventually, it's going to be 146 dead, 123 women and 23 men, most of them teenage immigrant girls, many of them falling on the fence below and getting impaled in front of everybody, the rest of them just with a thud landing on the sidewalk. And as you read reports, if you do go and dig through some primary documents, it's just heartbreaking how this affected that crowd. Most of these people had flashbacks the rest of their lives. It was something they couldn't burn out of their retina. Watching these dozens and dozens of young girls with their flying dresses in the sky, on fire, falling down and landing into their death and their mangled bodies littering the sidewalks of New York. After that, it's just going to be the consequences. So let's take a look at kind of the after effect the next day and the days after March 25th, 1911. So in terms of effects, let's take a look at kind of the short-term effects right away. There's a huge outcry. There's going to be a viewing on the pier where for 3 days they're going to have the bodies lined out as families came to try to identify the victims. And the accounts are going to be nationwide as people's hearts are ripped out, reading about the conditions that led to the death of 146 people. And immediately the attention goes to Isaac Harris and Max Blanche, who were put on trial for first-degree manslaughter for locking those doors on the girls. But eventually they're going to be acquitted because the prosecution couldn't prove that they actually knew the doors were locked, even though they're going to move that Triangle Shirtwaist factory that same year, and only a few months later they're going to be charged again with locking the doors and given a $20 fine. So I think the real problem is that there are no laws yet that are going to hold these people liable for the actions that they take. Now, there is going to be a civil lawsuit, and they're going to be found guilty at a civil level, and they're going to end up paying the families of the deceased, are you ready for this? Hold on to your hats, $75 a piece. Now, by the time they got the insurance money, they made $400 off each casualty. So even paying the victims' families out through litigation, they're still going to make a profit off this fire, which their negligence cost, which caused the death of so many people. Now, in terms of the other effects, there is a part of the union that's going to go radical at this point, more towards kind of the socialist and even later in the Communist Party. And you can hear Rose Schneiderman, who became a radical, talking at the memorial about how she believes action needs to be taken.
Public officials have only words of warning to us, warning that we must be intensely peaceful, and they have the workhouse just back of all their warnings. The strong hand of the law beats us back when we rise into the conditions that make life unbearable. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement.
Now, this is a great lesson to learn in history. When you do have something awful and terrible happen and you have a call for radical action, the government many times will come to moderate that radical call so people don't go crazy revolutionary and they're satisfied. So at that time period, you have Tammany Hall, a corrupt democratic political machine that's only interested in staying in power. But so whether they do it because of the better angels on their shoulders, or they do it because they believe there's voters that they can get and they can capitalize on this, they're going to change course radically. Tammany Hall, and specifically one of the proteges of the bosses at that time period, a man by the name of Al Smith, is going to go on a campaign to solve this problem. And they're really prodded on by social reformers. Now, one of the witnesses to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a social worker named Frances Perkins, and she was so moved by this. She had worked for the New York State Consumer League that she made it her mission to get reform done. And she'll go on to be appointed to Secretary of Labor for FDR. She becomes the first woman cabinet member. So Frances Perkins and other social reformers are going to team up with Tammany Hall, with Al Smith, with the New York State Senate, the New York State Assembly, and they're going to go on basically a factory investigation. They're going to take the testimony of over 200 witnesses. It's a 3,500-page report. They visited practically every factory in New York. Al Smith didn't miss one visit as they recorded, all of the incidences of unsafe working conditions and the lack of fire safety and child labor and the overcrowdedness and the hours. At the end of the day, the New York State legislature is going to pass 38 workplace regulatory laws, everything from mandating sprinklers and fire extinguishers to the number of fire escapes to the number of break rooms and hours that women could work and banning child labor. It is a huge social welfare regulatory law spree that they go on that all gets traced back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And like I said before, this transformed in a political way the Democratic Party of New York, moving from very corrupt kind of inside the businessman's pocket Tammany Hall to a progressive face, to a reform face of the Al Smith, who's going to eventually run for president, and he's going to be followed by no other than FDR. So that's the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Most importantly, understanding the context which the event develops, the horrific nature of the event itself, but most importantly, how it's going to propel social reformers and the Democratic Party and Tammany Hall into really following through. Because, before that, there was always reformers, but the politicians would never listen. But because of what happened on that day, the politicians are now listening. So there you go, guys. There is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. If you haven't checked out Hip Use History, we have tons of videos like this. In fact, over 450, if you can wrap your head around that. You can check us out online at www.hiphuse.com and visit the video arsenal, or just check us out on the YouTubes where you can subscribe, and that's all free and such, which you should do right now. All right, my friends, I'm going to say it because I say it. Wait a minute. I think I'm supposed to do a shout out. Time out. Jeremy and Mick from Union Pines. You've been like poking me on Instagram and such, so I told you I'd give you a shout out. So I'm giving you your shout out right now, and Mrs. Cunningham, who's like the best teacher there. All right, guys, remember, because I believe it with all my heart, where attention goes, energy flows. We'll see you, my friends, my learning friends, next time you press my buttons.